She crossed the whole length of the Ardent anniversary hall to claim me. 300 of the oldest blood in the valley between us. 50 years of one family seated at a banquet under the antlers and the candle iron. My own 4-year-old standing soot-handed by the great hearth. And the cold Heir's grandmother on her feet, at the head of the table in the middle of having me thrown out as a liar. Reverie Ardent, the coldest woman in the valley, and the one every soul at that feast had been raised to be afraid of, set down the carving knife she had just been handed, walked away from the head of her own family's table, came to a stop in front of the hearth cook her grandmother had paid 4 years ago to disappear, and said the sentence that cracked a 50-year feast down to its stone floor. That child by the fire is mine.
Hi everyone! Thank you for staying with me. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Stay close, stay connected.
I am going to tell you how a caterer in a soot-stained apron ended up being claimed, with the daughter they had all sworn was dead, in front of the people who had been paid to keep her invisible. But you have to let me go back, because nothing about that feast makes sense until you understand the 4 years I spent raising a child the woman who sired her had been told to bury. If you want the uncensored, too hot for YouTube version of this story, the parts I cannot tell here, it is on my Patreon, link in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. My name is Esme Calder, and I work in fire. Not the pretty part, not the plated course that goes out under silver domes, not the photograph in the society pages. I work the back of it, the cellar kitchens, and the open hearths and the long-banked coals, with my hands stained at the cuticle from 100 winters of other people's smoke. I am a hearth cook. I am one of the women a great house brings in to feed 300 mouths off a single roaring fire, to read a flame and a roast in a cauldron all at once, and bring it all to the table at the same hot minute, so that you will believe a feast simply appears. Most of the people who do my work do it with skill and timing and a back of iron, and they do it beautifully. And the house eats and never thinks of the smoke. I did it with all of that too. But I also did it with the other thing. The thing I have never once been able to write on an invoice. The thing that made me, by 26, quietly the best pair of hands at a fire in the whole valley. And just as quietly, the easiest woman in it to send out the kitchen door. I can read smoke. I do not know how else to say it so that it does not sound like a lie or a campfire story. And it is neither. Stand me at a hearth and let me watch the smoke come off it. The color of it. The way it leans and drifts. The scent layered under the scent. And I can read, somewhere behind my sternum in a place that has no name, the truth of the room it rises in. Not the dish on the fire, the thing under the dish. Not the words said over the table, the lie folded inside them. Smoke carries everything that has happened to a fire. Every fat that dripped, every green wood someone hid in the good wood, every secret burned in the grate that morning. And I can read it the way you read a face. Give me the smoke off a hearth and I can tell you who at that table is lying. Give me the drift off a burn barrel and I can tell you what was destroyed in it and how long ago. They cannot teach this. They try. They cannot. You either feel the smoke telling the truth or you do not. And I have felt it since I was a girl at my grandmother's cook fire with my eyes stinging. And it has made me, by 26, quietly extraordinary and just as quietly invisible, which in my experience are almost always the same woman. I want to show you the gift before I tell you what it cost, because otherwise it is only a claim, and I have spent my whole life refusing to be only a claim. Years ago, before any of this, I was a nobody scullery girl in a great winter house, and one bitter night I stood at the back hearth banking the coals, and I read the smoke going up the kitchen flue. Read it leaning wrong, read the scorched stone scent of a crack opening somewhere up in the dark of the chimney. And I knew, the way I know, that the flue was about to throw its heat into the old dry timber of the wing above. I told the steward. He looked at me the way you look at a girl who scrubs pots, and he told me the chimneys had been swept in autumn and to mind my coals. And I stood there, invisible, in an agony of knowing, and an hour later a beam in that wing caught exactly where the smoke had said it would. And because I had already quietly soaked the rafters and set the buckets in a row, I put it out before it took the house, and the steward wrote a report praising his own foresight with the buckets. and no one ever knew that a scullery girl had read it an hour early in the smoke. That is the gift, and that is the curse. The same woman, the same hour. I am right, and I am invisible. And I learned a long time ago that being right is worth nothing at all. If you have made yourself too small to be believed when you say the house is about to burn, remember that. It is the whole of what I had to unlearn. There was another time, and I tell you both because together they are the whole truth of what the gift is. A year after the chimney a family I cooked for fell to fighting over a dead man's will, and one gray morning, I was firing the bread ovens out in the yard, and I read the smoke coming off the estate's burn barrel, red in the drift and the scorch, and the particular sweetness of old rag paper and sealing wax, that someone had burned a stack of documents in it not an hour before, and read in the underscent which papers they were. I told the steward's clerk that the true will had been burned that morning and the ash was still warm in the barrel. He thanked me, and they raked the barrel, and there at the bottom was the scorched corner of the real will, with its seal half melted, and the right heirs got their inheritance, and the wrong one got the magistrate. And do you know what I got for it? Nothing. Not a line in the record. The clerk took the credit for thinking to check the barrel, and the family that won never knew that a cook in the yard had read the whole crime in a thread of smoke, and I went back to firing the ovens. I was right, and I was unheard, and I saved them, and I was still invisible. And that is the lesson the world spent 26 years teaching me twice over. Being right is not the same as being believed, and being believed is not the same as being seen. And a poor girl who smells of smoke is allowed, at most, one of the three on a good day, by accident. My grandmother is the reason I can do it, and she is the reason you are going to believe the rest. So let me set her down properly. She raised me. My mother was a name on the back of a feast day card and nothing more. So I had my grandmother, and she had cooked over open fires for the great houses of the valley for 50 years, in the smoke, in the years before the iron ranges came, when a cook's eyes and a cook's nose were the only thermometer a kitchen had. She could walk into a strange kitchen and tell you, from the smoke alone, which fire was sulking and which was about to scorch. She had an iron fire striker, an old blackened flint and steel worn smooth at the grip from 50 years in her hand, and the first true memory I have of being myself is her folding my two small fingers around that warm iron and teaching me the only thing I have ever really believed. Fire doesn't lie about what's been burned, Esme. People do, but a fire can't. She did not make a fuss of what I could do, the way I could read a flame and know the room. She made it ordinary. You just listen with your eyes and your nose. I understand now that it was the kindest and most protective thing she could have done, because she had seen what the great houses do to a poor girl who is gifted out loud. When she died, I was 19, and the only thing I took from her one smoke-dark room was that iron striker, and I have not lit a single fire without it in my apron for 7 years. Remember the striker. It comes back, the way the truth always does. My grandmother cooked until her hands would not hold the long fork anymore, and then she sat by the one window of our one room and got smaller, the way people who have fed others their whole lives get smaller when you take the feeding out of their hands. And I sat with her in the evenings before my own shifts, and we did not talk about dying. We talked about fire. She would close her eyes and have me describe a hearth to her and tell me, from her chair, from memory, from 50 years of reading smoke, what that fire was really doing under the dish. And she was nearly always right, the gift outliving the strength, the reading the last thing in her to go. The night before she died, she folded my fingers around the warm iron of the striker the way she had when I was small, and she did not make a speech because she never made speeches. She just said, "People will spend your whole life telling you what you are, Esme. A cook, only a cook. Just the smoke-stained help. Don't believe a word of it." Then I had an iron striker and a gift and a name on a feast day card, and nobody else in the world. And I went out and cooked over other people's fires for whoever would pay the least, which is how the best pair of hands at a hearth in the valley ended up firing the back ovens and calling it getting by. So that is the shape of me when the Ardent name first reached down into my small life. The best hearth cook in the valley, and the cheapest, and the most disposable. A woman who could read a fire's truth an hour early, and had spent her whole life learning that the reading was worth nothing unless someone with a name decided to spend their own standing on it. I had a place in the kitchens of a great estate by then. Not the Ardents yet, that comes later. That is the wound. Just a back kitchen post, firing the bread, feeding the staff, called for when a feast needed more hands and forgotten the morning after. I told myself I had made my peace with being right and invisible. I had not made my peace with anything. I had just gotten very, very good at looking like a woman who had. I have to tell you about Reverie Ardent, and I have to tell you about the one winter I knew her before I knew what she would cost me. Because everything that broke in me broke in the order it was built. And I built it a little over 4 years ago, in the heat and dark of a kitchen that was not my own. The Ardents are the kind of old that has stopped meaning money and started meaning land. 50 years of one anniversary feast counting backward into 100 more. A pack name carved into the lintel of an estate called the Vale. Blood so old the valley still bowed to it out of habit. I told her the truth, because no one had ever asked. You watch the smoke, not the flame, I said. A fire tells you it's going to spit a full minute before it does. And she did not laugh. And she did not look at me the way the great look at the help. She looked at me the way you look at a language you'd given up hoping anyone still spoke. She stayed 2 hours in that kitchen, watching my hands, asking me what the smoke of a thing meant, and I told her that this fire was sulking on green wood someone had hidden in the rick, that one had been lit in a hurry, that the burn barrel out the yard door had eaten letters that morning and not kitchen scraps. She went very still at that, and when she finally left, she did not have the next feast's cooking sent up to her the usual way. She came down herself, and the winter, which I had been dreading the way I dread every cold season at someone else's fire, became the only winter I have ever been warm in. There was a particular night, early, that told me what kind of alpha she really was under the cold. It was past midnight, the great house above us asleep, and I was banking the last of the kitchen fire, and she was sitting on the bench at the end of the long table, where an heir has no business sitting, watching, and she said, out of nowhere, to the dark and not to me, "Nobody has ever asked me what I want." And I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was to take her cold hand and hold it out over the banked coals, close enough to feel the live heat still breathing under the gray ash, and tell her to feel how a true fire keeps its warmth long after everyone has decided it's gone out. She held her hand there a long time, this woman who held nothing, and something in her face came loose that I do not think had come loose in front of anyone in years. Remember that she did not know then how to want a thing out loud. It is the whole of what she had to unlearn, and it cost us 4 years before she did. That was the beginning of the only season of my life I would not trade. It did not look like anything at first. It looked like the coldest air in the valley, finding reasons to be down in a kitchen she had no reason to be in. To check on the feast, she said, though the feast did not need her. And standing at my shoulder while I worked, and not saying very much, just watching me read the truth out of smoke. No one with a name had ever, in my whole life, decided that the feeling behind a hearthcook's sternum was worth standing in the heat and the dark for. She made me real by paying attention. I did not have a word for what that did to me. I have one now, and it is the word I spent that winter refusing to think, and then could not unthink, and then was carrying like a live coal behind my ribs where no one could see it. Because by the time the thaw came, the heir of the Ardent pack had quietly, with no witness but the banked fire and one stolen night, given me the only true thing she ever owned. I have to tell you the whole of what made Reverie Ardent cold, because it is the thing that made her 4 years later burn it all down at a feast. She was not born cold. She was made cold deliberately by a family that had spent a century learning that feeling is a thing the bloodline cannot afford. They taught her, patiently, over a childhood, that an Ardent's heart is a thing the pack spends, that warmth is for the people you feed and not for yourself, that her job was to be the iron carried at the head of the table. By the time she came down to my kitchen, she had a bond of her own already drawn up somewhere in her grandmother's plans, a suitable match with a suitable name, and she had genuinely never once been asked in her whole life what she wanted as opposed to what she would carry. That is what I was to her, before I was anything else. Not romance at first, but the first evidence in a lifetime that wanting was even permitted. I have thought a great deal in the cold years since about how dangerous it is to be the first true thing a person raised on duty is ever handed. It is the kind of thing a family will throw a girl out a kitchen door to take back. I should tell you the truth about how it happened, because I have promised you the truth. It started as attention, and for a woman who has been invisible her whole life, attention from the one person who refuses to look away is a more dangerous thing than any touch. We talked at first only of fire, but she started staying past the point of any feast, in the heat of the banked kitchen, and telling me things about the grandmother who had measured her like a blade her whole childhood, about the suitable alpha her family kept seating beside her at the long table, about how she had never once in her life eaten a meal that was cooked for her and not for the name. And one night, near the end of that winter, with the fire down to coals between us, she looked at me with that contained, unreadable face coming apart at the edges, and said the most reckless thing an Ardent has ever said. Everyone in my life is keeping the fire for the house. And then there was one night that was only ours, the kind of night a kitchen keeps and never tells. And 3 weeks later, she was promised in front of the whole pack to the suitable alpha her grandmother had chosen. And I was gone out the kitchen door in the dark. And neither of us yet knew that the winter had left a third person behind. I have gone back to that one night 1,000 times in the 4 years since, because it is the seam where my whole life folds. It did not feel, that night, like a thing that would cost anyone anything. It felt like the first warm hour either of us had ever stolen. Two women who had each spent their whole lives keeping a fire, for somebody else finally turning and keeping one for each other. She was not cold that night. That is the part I held on to through everything that came after. The part no purse and no poured-on grief could ever quite burn out of me. That for one night, the iron air of the Ardent pack was just a woman in the firelight who wanted to be wanted. And I was just a cook who knew how to read the want coming off her like heat off a coal. And we did not pretend, not once, not either of us, that it was anything less than true. And then her grandmother put a suitable bond in front of her 3 weeks later. And the cold came back down over her like a lid over embers. And I told myself the warmth had been mine to borrow and never mine to keep. And I went the way I always went before anyone could tell me to. Her grandmother is the reason for the 4 years that followed, and her calm is the most frightening thing in this story, so let me set her down properly. The Dowager Cressida Ardent, the matriarch, the keeper of the bloodline, the woman who had run the pack from behind her granddaughter for 40 years, did not rage when she learned the heir had been warming her hands at a hearth cook's fire. Women like that never have to. She came down to the kitchen herself, which she had never done, and she did not threaten me, because she is far too clever for that. She told me in that even, almost gentle voice, exactly what I was. A cook with no name and no land, and a place that lived entirely at the mercy of references. The great houses passed between them like coin. She told me what the pack would do to a girl who let herself become the scandal that pulled the air off the bond the bloodline needed. The work I would never get again. The way they would make a smoke-stained nobody into a grasping little schemer and burn me out of every kitchen in the valley. And then she made me the offer. The purse, the kind coat over the cold thing, a sum of money and a place in a kitchen at the far end of the country, and a clean, quiet leaving in exchange for vanishing out of Reverie's life before I ruined it. To protect her, the woman said, so she can carry what she was born to carry without you hanging off the name. I want to tell you exactly what I did in that kitchen, because it is the proudest and the stupidest thing I have ever done. And I have spent 4 years unable to decide which. I did not take her money. I want you to hear that. The cook, the nobody at the backfire. I stood up in a kitchen that wasn't mine, with the dowager's purse open on the scrub table, and I told her I did not want her family's silver, and I took my grandmother's iron striker and my one good apron, and I did the thing my pride told me was the only clean thing left. I left in the dark, on my own terms, with nothing of theirs, and I did not tell Reverie I was going, because I could not bear to watch her be made to choose. And here is the part the dowager did not know yet, the part that is the whole black heart of this story. I was carrying her granddaughter's child, and I did not learn it for certain until I was 100 miles gone. So I made my arrangements alone, the way I had done everything alone, and I had my daughter in a rented room above a tavern kitchen with no one's hand to hold, and I named her Ember for the one warm thing I had carried out of that house, and I raised her on a cook's wages and told no one in the valley she existed. Remember that I left without the silver. It is the thing the dowager could never forgive me, that she had not been able to buy the one woman who knew her bloodline's secret. What the dowager did when she could not buy my silence cleanly is the thing I did not learn until the feast. And it is the cruelest thing in this whole cruel story. So brace yourself the way I wish someone had braced me. She told Reverie the child had died. When her people finally traced where I had gone and learned that a child had been born, she did not threaten me again. She had the true birth register quietly taken out of the tavern town, and a death forged over it by a paid clerk. And she let the heir believe that the hearth cook's baby had been born sickly and not lasted its first winter. A closed and finished and conveniently unprovable thing. A small grief, easily folded into the larger duty of a suitable bond. For 4 years, Reverie Ardent grieved a daughter she had been told was dead, and a lover she had been told was bought, and she let the cold close back over her, the way her family had always wanted. And she went on toward the arranged bond, like a woman walking into a winter she'd stopped expecting to survive. And 100 miles away, I raised that exact daughter by a tavern fire, alive and copper-haired and gray-eyed, and so, like her other mother, it stopped my breath some mornings, and neither of us knew, not the grieving heir, not the hiding cook, that the dowager had poured a death over a living child the way you smother a fire you mean to keep everyone from warming at. Ember was a hearth child from the first hour, the way I was, the way my grandmother was before me. She learned to walk on the warm stones of a tavern kitchen, and she learned to talk in the language of a fire, too hot, sulking, ready, before she had the words for it. And by 3, she would stand at my hip while I cooked and tell me, grave and certain, which pot was about to catch and which guest at the tavern table was telling a lie. And she was right. She was always right. The gift come down to a 3rd generation in a copper-haired little girl who did not yet know it was a gift. I told myself I was glad she'd never have to use it for anyone but herself. I taught her my grandmother's striker the way my grandmother taught me, folding her small fingers around the warm blackened iron. And on the long nights, I let her hold the locket with the stolen likeness in it, and I told her that was the other person who loved her, away over the hills, who would have kept a fire warm for her too. I meant it as a kindness, a story to fill the cold side of the bed. I did not know I was teaching my daughter the exact face that would, one feast night, walk her straight into the truth. I want you to have the truth about those 4 years, because the story makes leaving sound noble, and it was not. It was only survival dressed as pride, with a baby on my hip. I cooked in tavern kitchens and at other people's feasts in towns where no one had ever heard the Ardent name, and I raised Ember in the warm and the smoke, and she grew up at my apron strings the way I grew up at my grandmother's, a grave little thing who watched a fire the way other children watch a story. I told myself I had done the brave thing, the clean thing, asking nothing of a house that would have burned me to nothing. Most days I even believed it. But some nights, after Ember was asleep by the banked tavern fire, I sat with my grandmother's cold iron in my hand and felt the truth my own gift would not let me lie about, that I had decided, all by myself, that my daughter and I were not worth the trouble we would have been, that I had agreed with Cressida Ardent in the end, that we were a thing to be managed and moved along, and that the proudest thing I ever did was also maybe the most cowardly, and that the two had been the same act all along. The work brought me back. That is the small cruel joke of a poor woman's craft. Get good enough at a fire and the great houses come looking, and they do not always remember to check whose daughter they are inviting through the kitchen door. I had built a name for myself by then. Quiet, by word of mouth. The hearth cook you hired when a feast had to be perfect off a single fire. And when the steward of a great estate up the valley sent for the best in the county to run the open hearth for a 50-year anniversary. The booking came through an agent and a deposit in a hire cart. With no name on it I recognized until the cart turned in at a lintel carved with one word. And I sat there with my striker in my apron, and my 4-year-old asleep against my side and read the smoke rising off the chimneys of a house I had sworn never to enter. And the word over the door in stone was Ardent. I almost turned the cart around in the gateway. I want you to know that I almost ran, but it was a day's drive back down the valley, and I had a child and a half-paid deposit, and a reputation that lived on never walking off a job. And the under-steward who met the cart told me the family was away until the eve of the feast, and the kitchens needed taking in hand now. So I told myself I would cook the feast, take the fee, and be gone with my daughter before the heir of the Ardent pack ever laid eyes on either of us. I did not let myself think the name. I did not let myself think the winter, or the banked fire, or the woman I had loved for one season and lost to a purse. I put Ember to sleep on a pallet in the warm corner of the great hearth kitchen, and I took the iron striker out of my apron, and I lit the anniversary fires, and I told myself, the way you tell yourself the thing you most need to be true, that we could be invisible at the Ardents' table for 3 days and then go. It was Ember who undid the plan, the way it is always the child, because a 4-year-old does not know there are truths that are not allowed. I went cold to the marrow, because I keep one thing, the one foolish thing a cook with no money keeps, a little locket with a stolen likeness in it of the woman who'd kept a fire warm for me one winter. And I'd let my daughter hold it on the long nights and tell her that was the other person who loved her, and she had just walked into a 100-year-old gallery and found that exact face 4 feet tall in oils and known it for her own. I should have packed the cart and gone that night. I knew it the way I know a fire is about to turn. But a feast for 300 does not let a hired cook simply leave, not the day before, not with the deposit half spent and the family due home by dark, and I had nowhere to run to anyway, that the Ardent reach didn't cover. So I did the thing the trapped have always done, which is to put my head down and tend the fire and pray to be invisible one more day. I told Ember the picture was only a lady who looked like her locket, and she let me believe she believed me the way children do when they love you. And I worked through the night building the anniversary feast off that great roaring hearth, and the whole time my gift was screaming at me in the smoke, the house filling with arriving blood, the burn barrel out the yard door eating something it shouldn't, the particular sourness of a lie being kept warm somewhere above me in the great rooms. And I read all of it, and understood none of it, and told myself it was only nerves. Because a cook reads danger and smoke, and the most dangerous thing in that house was the family came home on the eve of the feast in a long line of carriages, and the heir came with them, and I did not see her. I made very sure not to see her, kept to the deep kitchen, sent the courses up by the underservants. But I felt the house change the way you feel weather change in a sealed room. There is a particular quality to the air of a great house when the one it was built around walks back into it, and the veil took on that quality at dusk. And somewhere up in the candlelit rooms above my hearth, the woman I had loved for one winter sat down to dine with the suitable alpha her grandmother had finally pinned her to, marigold sterling, polished and approved, and 1 season from the bond, and grieved, without knowing it, a daughter who was asleep on a pallet 4 floors below her, by the fire, with her own gray eyes. I have to tell you about marigold sterling because she's the one who lit the match, and the cruelty of it is that she did not even know what she was lighting. Marigold sterling was the alpha the dowager had chosen, years ago and again now, to be Reveries' suitable bond, a polished, ambitious, well-bred alpha from exactly the right branch of exactly the right pack, the proper match, the one the bloodline approved of. She had come up expecting to be mistress of the Vale one day, and in the 4 years I was gone, she had moved closer to it. A fixture now at the head table on Reverie's silent arm, the bonding always one feast away, and she had the kind of casual contempt for the help that the very approved always have, and she had no idea, sweeping through the lower passages on the morning of the feast to inspect the arrangements, that the soot-stained caterer she was about to make an example of in front of 300 guests was the only person in that house who could read what her future grandmother-in-law had been burning in the yard. There is one more person I have to set down before the feast itself, because every story like mine has one soul who refuses to be complicit. And at the Vale, it was a blind old man named Florian. Florian had kept the great hearth of the Ardent estate for 60 years, had kept it since before he lost his sight, and kept it after, because a man who has read a fire that long reads it with more than his eyes. He found me at the hearth the first morning, drawn by the way I laid a fire, and he put his old hand near the flame, and then near my face, and said the strangest thing anyone said to me in that whole house. "You read the smoke. I haven't met another in 40 years. He did not know whose I was. He only knew, the way the old keepers always know, that the gift had come back into his kitchen. And across the long days of the feast, he became the one person at the Vale who looked at me and saw a craftswoman and not a smudge. And when the worst hour came, it was old blind Florian who stood up in front of the whole pack and swore that the cook could read a fire the way the dowager swore she could not. He found me at the hearth the night before the feast, when the house had gone quiet and the family was not yet home, and he sat on the keeper's stool with his blind face to the fire and asked me, gently, the way the old ask the things they already half know, whose I was. I did not answer him, but the fire answered for me, I think, the way I tended it, the particular care, the green coal I pulled before it could sulk. And he was quiet a while, and then he said the thing that has kept me warm on every cold night since. "There's no shame in the smoke, girl," he said. "They'll tell you all your life that the people who keep the fire are beneath the people who sit at the table. It's the oldest lie a great house tells, and it's the easiest one to read through, if you've got the nose for it." I did not understand him fully that night. I understood him completely the next, with 300 of the oldest blood in the valley about to call me a liar, and a burn barrel out the yard door full of everything the dowager had tried to set alight. The feast itself was the most beautiful thing I have ever built, and the worst night of my life, and the two were the same fire. 300 of the oldest blood in the valley under the antlers and the candle iron. 50 years of one family laid out down a table you could not see the end of. And every course of it came up off my hearth at the hot, hot minute. Perfect. Because being right and invisible is the one thing I have always been able to do. I kept to the kitchen end. I kept Ember close, told her to mind the warm corner and not to wander, gave her a wooden spoon and a bowl of dried beans to keep her hands busy. I was going to feed the Ardent pack the best feast of their 100 years, and slip out the kitchen door before dawn with my daughter and my fee, and never be seen. And for the length of the soup and the fish and the first roast, it almost worked. And then the family rose for the anniversary toast, and the doors between the kitchen and the hall stood open for the carrying of the great roast. And my daughter, who had been so good, slipped off her pallet to see the candles, and walked out into the light of a 50-year feast looking for the lady from the locket. I came through the kitchen doors after her with my heart in my throat, and a carving fork still in my hand, and I was 3 steps too late. The hall had gone the particular quiet of 300 well-bred people watching a small child do something no one knows how to stop. Ember had crossed half the length of that great table, copper hair and a cook's child's plain dress and soot on her hands, and she had stopped in front of the head of the table where the heir of the pack sat in candle iron and gray silk beside her approved and polished bride. And my daughter looked up at Reverie Ardent, the coldest woman in the valley, 4 feet of painted oil come down off the gallery wall and seated in front of her in the warm flesh. and she did the thing she had been waiting her whole short life to do. I have never heard a room make the sound that room made. 300 of the oldest blood in the valley drawing one breath at the same instant. And I watched it land on Reverie Ardent like a struck blow. I watched the woman who had buried a daughter in her own heart 4 years ago, who had let the cold close over her because the child was dead and the lover was bought, look down into a pair of gray eyes that wore her own gray eyes in a copper-haired little face. And I watched 4 years of a grief she'd been handed by her grandmother begin in one breath to come apart at the seams. She did not move. She could not. And into that terrible held silence, before the air could find a single word, the Dowager Cressida Ardent rose at the head of her own anniversary table, calm as cold water, and did what women like her have always done with a truth they cannot afford. She reached for the lie, fast and smooth, and called for the help to be removed. "Whose child is this?" the Dowager said. "Not to me, to the hall," in that even carrying voice that had run the pack for 40 years. Some kitchen girl's byblow wandered in off the hearth and coached to make a scene. You can see the woman there in the doorway with the fork, the caterer. She turned the whole weight of 300 years on me standing in the kitchen doorway in my soot-stained apron, and she made it sound so reasonable, so obvious, the way the powerful always make the truth sound like the scheme. Of course the help would do this. Of course the cook would coach her child. Of course there was no dead daughter come walking back to a feast. Only a smudge of a woman reaching above her station. And Marigold Sterling laughed the bright, cruel laugh of a woman relieved, and said something about the quality of caterers these days, and called me the smoke-stained help, and the hall began, in that wave you can almost see, to decide that the Dowager was right, and I was nothing. And I stood there, with the oldest pain I have, the certainty that I am the one you pay to leave in the dark, rising up to swallow me whole, and then I smelled it. I want to tell you what saved us, because it was not my courage, and it was not Reverie's love, not yet. It was the smoke. Standing in that doorway with 300 faces turning against me, I caught it the way I have caught every true thing in my life, under the roast and the candles and the perfume of the grate, the sour, particular scent of the burn barrel out the yard door, clinging where it should not have been, in the warm air at the head of that table, clinging specifically to the sleeve of the Dowager's own gray gown. Cressida Ardent had been at the burn barrel that very morning, and I knew, the way I know a flue is about to crack, exactly what a woman like her burns at dawn, on the day a feast might dig up her bloodline's oldest secret. So I did the thing the smoke-stained help is never supposed to have the nerve to do. I did not defend myself. I lifted my chin and I said, loud enough to carry to the cold stone at the back of that hall, "Then let us read the fire, Dowager. You burned something in the yard barrel this morning. I can smell it on your sleeve from here." The hall did not laugh that time. You do not laugh when the help stops being afraid. The Dowager's calm flickered. Just a flicker. Just the half-second a fire gives you before it spits. And into that flicker, old blind Florian, who had kept that hearth for 60 years, climbed slowly to his feet at the servant's end and said, in the cracked carrying voice of a man, no one in that valley would dare call a liar. "The girl reads smoke, my lady, true as her grandmother before her, and her grandmother never missed. If she says you burned something, you burned something. I've kept your fire 60 years. And they raked the ardent burn barrel in front of 300 guests, and they brought what was left of it into that hall on a fire shovel. And there at the bottom of the ash, scorched but not gone, was the half-burned register page that recorded a live birth in a tavern town 4 years before. And beside it, melted but legible, the forged death record the Dowager had paid a clerk to write to tell her own granddaughter the child was gone. I have never, before or since, watched a room change its mind about a person as fast as that hall changed its mind about me. It moved through 300 of the oldest blood in the valley, in a wave you could almost see, the recalculation, the sudden frantic reweighing. Every guest who had a moment ago decided the cook was a grasping nobody. abruptly understanding that they had nearly been caught on the wrong side of a truth burned in a barrel at dawn. Marigold Sterling's bright, cruel laugh died in her throat. The cold relations, who had murmured agreement with the dowager, went the particular gray of people remembering exactly which side of a powerful woman they had just been standing on. And the dowager Cressida Ardent, who had run this whole pack from behind her granddaughter for 40 years, stood at the head of her own anniversary table and watched a thing happen that she had paid 4 years and a clerk's forgery and a child's whole grieved over life to prevent. The truth coming up out of the ash where she had buried it, read aloud by the smoke-stained help she had been so sure would stay too small to be believed. Reverie. Ardent rose from the head of her own table then, slowly, the way the proud rise, and she crossed the whole length of that 50-year feast, past the dowager gone gray and silent, past Marigold Sterling's frozen smile, past 300 of the oldest blood in the valley, and she came to a stop in front of the soot-stained caterer her grandmother had paid to disappear, and she looked from the half-burned register in the steward's hands to the copper-haired child to my face, and she did the arithmetic 4 years of a poured-on grief had kept her from doing, and she stopped breathing for a moment, and then she said it, in that even voice that carried to the back of the hall, "That child by the fire is mine." She turned the full weight of the heir's authority on the dowager. What undid me was not the register, and it was not the claim. It was that she went down on one knee on the stone floor of that great hall, in her gray silk, in front of her whole assembled pack, and held out her arms to a 4-year-old in a cook's child's dress with soot on her hands. And Ember, who had been waiting her whole short life for the lady from the locket to be real, looked back at me to ask, the way children ask, whether this was allowed, and I could not speak. I could only nod. And my daughter walked the last few feet from the kitchen warm fringe of that table into her other mother's arms. And Reverie Ardent, the coldest woman in the valley, gathered up the daughter she had been told was dead and pressed her face into the copper hair and made a sound I have never heard a human being make before or since. And into that sound, my whole 4 years of pride and grief and folded down silence came apart on the back of my neck like ash off a roof, because I understood, watching them, that the cold had never been the truth of her. It had been the grief, and the grief had been a lie. I want to tell you what it did to me to watch them meet, because it is the thing I will carry to my own grave. For 4 years, I had been the only one who knew my daughter's whole face, the only one who had counted her fingers and walked her fevers, and learned the particular grave way she watches a fire. And I had carried that knowing alone, the way you carry a coal in your bare hands, because to set it down anywhere in the valley was to lose her. And now there was a second person on the earth looking at Ember the way I look at her, seeing the whole of her at once. And it was the woman I had spent 4 years teaching myself not to want. I had braced for jealousy. I had braced, somewhere under the pride, for the old terror that the great would take her and leave me the kitchen door. And none of it came. What came instead, watching the coldest woman in the valley press her face into my daughter's copper hair and shake, was a relief so total it buckled my knees. The simple animal relief of a woman who has carried a thing alone too long, finally feeling another set of hands take the weight. I was not losing her. For the first time in 4 years, I was not the only one holding her up. The dowager tried, once, because women like her always try once, in the wreck of the feast, with the forged record curling on the fire shovel, and 300 witnesses doing the arithmetic she had spent 4 years preventing. She crossed to me, not to her granddaughter, to me, the cook. And she said in that low, even voice meant only for the two of us, that this could still be arranged quietly, that there were settlements, that a sum twice the first could be discussed for the child to be raised properly as an Ardent, while I was provided for very comfortably elsewhere. And I want to tell you about the second the cold woman offered me money over my found daughter's head, because it is the second I stopped forever, being the thing you pay to leave in the dark. Because I had refused her once already, out of pride, and it had cost me 4 years and a poured-on grief, and very nearly cost a grieving woman her own living child. And I was not going to be proud this time. And I was not going to be afraid this time. I was going to be a mother. So I took the dowager's offered purse out of her hand, very gently, the way you take a thing too hot to hold. And I turned and dropped it into the great hearth, and we all watched her silver burn, and I said, loud enough for the leaning guest to hear, "Fire doesn't lie about what's been burned, Cressida. You taught me that yourself 4 years ago, when you thought you could smother a thing and call it dead. This whole house has been smoke." And the dowager, who had never in 40 years met a thing she could not buy, went quiet. Reverie heard the whole of that. She had not let go of the child. She had crossed to my side with Ember on her hip and her free hand at the small of my back, letting me face her grandmother because she understood, finally, that I did not need to be protected from this family so much as I needed to be allowed to stand inside it as myself. And when the dowager had gone quiet, and the silver had burned down to nothing in the grate, I will say it now because that night I finally let myself. The woman I had loved for 1 winter and lost to a purse leaned down and said one thing into my ear, low, just for me. The first wholly unguarded thing she had let herself say in a hall full of her own blood in 4 years. She told me you took the money and lost the baby on the road. I believed her, and I understood that the cold woman's great mistake had never been cruelty. It had been the same mistake the powerful always make about the ones they love, believing the grief that someone else built for them, because they were raised from the cradle to trust the keeper of the bloodline over the cook at the fire. She had learned it in a great hall, in front of her whole pack, the hard way, the only way the truly proud ever learn anything. And she would spend the rest of our life unlearning it out loud. We did not leave that feast by the kitchen door I had come in by. She would not let me. When the guests had been sent home into the dark and the long table stood wrecked and candle-guttered, Reverie walked me down the center of that 50-year hall with our daughter asleep on her shoulder and my soot-stained hand in hers, at the exact unhurried pace of a woman who has nothing left to hide, past the head of the table where her grandmother sat alone and gray, past the place where Marigold Sterling's chair stood empty. Old blind Florian was banking the great hearth as we passed, the way he had for 60 years, and he turned his sightless face toward the sound of us and inclined his head, the small grave bow you give to someone who has finally stopped waiting to be seen and simply walked out into the light. And I thought of his words by the fire, the last one they sent away, and I understood that the old keeper had known, or half known from the first morning, and had quietly kept the one truth alive in that house that the dowager could not smother, that the gift does not lie, and neither does the fire it reads. I want to tell you about the days that followed, because the feast is where the cage broke, but it is not where the love is. The love is in the ordinary after. We told Ember slowly, in our own time, the way you tell a small child a large, true thing, that the lady from the locket was real now and was not going away, that she had 2 mothers, one who had kept her warm and one who had grieved her, and that the grieving was over. She took it the way children take the truth, which is to say easily, as though she had always known the lady on the gallery wall would step down and be hers. And Reverie, who had never in her life been asked what she wanted, learned to sit on a kitchen floor by the warm hearth and want things out loud. Another fire story, a worse drawing, one more night with the child between us, the iron air of the Ardent pack undone by a 4-year-old and a banked fire. I have never seen anything funnier or more like Grace. The reckoning inside the family was quieter and took longer, the way these things do. Cressida Ardent did not vanish overnight. Women like her never do. But a matriarch's whole power is built on being the one who decides what the bloodline will and will not survive. And she had just been shown, in front of every soul who matters, that her own granddaughter would survive the truth, and that she, the woman who had burned a living child's record and poured a grief over the air to keep her on the leash, could not. The pack, which had spent 40 years afraid of her, did the arithmetic the valley was already doing, and discovered that an heir who claims the mother of her child and the daughter she was lied out of is worth a great deal more to a 100-year name than a dowager who burns birth registers in the yard at dawn. Reverie did not have her grandmother turned out into the cold. She did the thing the Iron Woman understood far better, which was to take the keeping of the bloodline out of her hands and simply stop letting her decide. And Marigold Sterling, who had laughed first and called me the smoke-stained help, found that the great houses have long memories for being made to laugh at the wrong woman, and that an approved bond can quietly stop being approved. I did not have to do anything to either of them. I just had to be, in the end, exactly who I had always been, which they had both bet their whole futures on being nothing. I kept my fire, I want you to know that. I kept cooking, kept my grandmother's iron striker in my apron, kept reading the smoke, because a woman who marries into a name and gives up the one thing that is truly hers has not married. She has been swallowed, and I had promised my grandmother and my daughter and myself that I would never do that. But now my name is on the work, and the great houses of the valley send for the hearth cook who read a forged death out of a burn barrel at the Ardent feast. And I run the great fire at the Vale itself now, when the pack gathers. No longer the smoke-stained nobody they send out the kitchen door, but the woman the heir of the house walks down to stand beside at the hearth. And in the evenings, the coldest woman in the valley comes down to my kitchen, the way she did that first winter, and sits on the bench at the end of the long table while I bank the fire. And she does not say very much, because she never did. And our daughter falls asleep in the warm corner, with her small hand around an iron striker that has now been held by 3 generations of women who could not be lied to. I want to tell you what the after is actually made of, because the feast is where the cage broke, but it is not where the love is. The love is in the ordinary, the warm, the ungrieved hours. It is in the fact that she introduces me now to the coldest blood in the valley as Esme, the finest reader of a true thing alive and the mother of my child, and watches me get bigger instead of smaller, and means it. It is in the way she comes down to the hearth at the end of her iron days, and lets the cold come off her like a coat she is finally allowed to take off, and tells me sometimes what she wanted, and not just what she'll carry, because she is learning, slowly, that she is allowed to want things out loud. It is in my grandmother's iron striker, warm now in a third small hand, and a fire we light together every winter, not to grieve anymore, but in thanks. For a daughter the smoke would not let stay buried. We are not a fairy tale. We are 2 proud, damaged, private people who kept one true fire for each other one winter, and then had it smothered and lied over, and very nearly lost forever, and dug it back out of the ash in front of 300 witnesses, and built an ordinary family out of the wreck of a 100-year cage. That is better than a fairy tale. Fairy tales are smoke. This one I can hold my hand over, and feel the live heat still breathing under the ash, and tell you in my grandmother's voice, it's true. Because my grandmother was right in the end about the only thing that ever mattered. Fire doesn't lie about what's been burned. People do. They call you the help, the smoke-stained nobody, the thing best paid to leave in the dark, the schemer who'd put a word in a baby's mouth. But the truth holds in the ash and the drift and the scent under the scent. And the only job you have is to be quiet enough and brave enough to read it and to say it out loud before the lie can be poured over a living thing and called dead. I spent 4 years too proud and too lied to know that the woman who'd loved me was grieving the very child I was raising by a tavern fire, 100 miles and 1 forged record away. And then one winter feast, a small girl with gray eyes walked the length of a great table and called the coldest woman in the valley by the only name that fit, and a burn barrel gave up its secret, and the cold air crossed her own hall to claim the daughter they had told her was dead. That child by the fire is mine, she said, with 300 of her own blood watching. She was right. I always was. And no one, ever again, gets to call the true thing nothing.